Aviation crash investigators are in Monterey County, California tonight, trying to determine the cause of an accident that killed John Denver. The country rock singer died after the experimental plane he was piloting crashed into the Pacific just after takeoff.
He sang about sunshine, but carried storms inside. Sounds dramatic, doesn't it? But here's the unsettling truth. Behind John Denver's warm voice and peaceful image lay a tension so deep that even those closest to him struggled to see its full shape. His music felt like a safe place, gentle, comforting, almost innocent. Yet the man behind those melodies was wrestling with pressures, expectations, and private conflicts that slowly pushed him toward a moment that still raises questions today. So let me ask you this. What really happened to John Denver? Why did a man who seemed to have everything, worldwide fame, artistic mastery, a devoted fan base, and a sense of purpose bigger than himself, end up alone in an experimental aircraft known for design flaws that pilots had complained about for years? And even more troubling, why did he choose to fly it anyway? Was it confidence, oversight, or something he wasn't saying out loud? These aren't just dramatic questions. They matter because they get to the heart of a mystery that puzzled investigators, devastated fans, and left aviation experts shaking their heads. To understand his final flight, we have to understand the man, his past, his pressures, his secrets. So let's rewind. From Roswell to Rocky Mountains, John Denver wasn't born in the spotlight. He entered the world as Henry John Deutschendorf Jr. in Roswell, New Mexico. Yes, that Roswell, the one forever tied to UFO myths and Cold War paranoia. But there was nothing extraterrestrial about John's childhood. What shaped him wasn't science fiction, but something far more real. Life inside a strict, itinerant military family. His father, a decorated U.S. Air Force pilot, demanded discipline, precision, and obedience. Traits that clashed with John's introspective, artistic spirit. By the time he reached his teenage years, John had lived in more than a dozen cities, never putting down roots. Always the new kid, always adjusting. Have you ever felt like you didn't belong anywhere? Like you were constantly starting over while the world kept moving without you? Now imagine that being your entire upbringing. That emotional dislocation leaves a mark. But here's where John Denver was different. Instead of turning bitter or hard, he found solace in something quiet, eternal, and grounding. Nature. The vast, open landscapes of the American Southwest and the soaring mountain ranges he glimpsed during family relocations became his emotional anchor. The sky wasn't just a view, it was escape. The trees weren't just trees, they were stability. Nature became his first and only reliable home. That love seeped into his soul and, later, into every lyric he wrote. What's remarkable is how those landscapes didn't just influence his aesthetic. They gave him an identity. While most kids chased belonging through people or popularity, John found it in rivers, valleys, and mountaintops. And those spaces, untouched by human expectation, would later allow him to express feelings he never could in the confines of a rigid, transient military life. The wild gave him language. The earth gave him meaning. A guitar, a dream, a new name. At 11, John received a guitar, a simple, second-hand instrument that would unknowingly unlock a lifelong purpose. It wasn't polished or professional, but that didn't matter. The moment his fingers touched the strings, something clicked. The guitar became more than an object. It was a companion, a voice, a tool to translate what he couldn't say out loud. And for a boy who never stayed in one place long enough to make real friends, that mattered more than anyone realized. He immersed himself in the music of Elvis Presley, the Kingston Trio, and later, Bob Dylan. But while others copied, John internalized. Music wasn't about imitation. It was about building a world he could finally belong to, one chord at a time, He started writing songs that felt like sanctuary lyrics became shelter. Melody became identity. Still, the practical world loomed. Following his father's expectations, John enrolled in Texas Tech University to study architecture. But that path always felt like a costume. While professors talked about blueprints and buildings, John sketched songs in the margins of his notebooks. He wasn't designing structures, he was designing an escape. The real transformation came when he moved to Los Angeles. It wasn't just a relocation, it was a rebirth. Henry John Deutschendorf Jr. was gone. In his place stood John Denver, a name that was simpler, yes, but also intentional. Denver, like the city nestled in the Rockies, symbolized peace, openness, and natural beauty. It was a name that matched the landscape within him. And maybe that's what we often miss about names. They're not just labels. They're declarations. John wasn't running from who he was. He was running toward who he needed to be. The guitar was his compass. The songs were the map. And now, the journey had truly begun. Sky-high success. You know the hits. Leaving on a jet plane, Take Me Home, Country Roads, Annie's Song. These weren't just chart toppers. They became emotional landmarks. Songs played at weddings, funerals, graduations. Songs that made strangers cry in their cars without knowing exactly why. John Denver wasn't just making music. He was embedding himself into people's memories. His voice had the rare power to sound both vast and intimate, like the horizon whispering directly to your heart. But with every standing ovation came something more complicated. Fame doesn't just elevate, it distorts. Denver quickly became more than an artist. He became a brand. There were sold-out tours, primetime TV specials, talk show appearances, and even movie roles, most notably alongside George Burns in Oh God. Audiences loved his warmth, his gentleness, his clean image. He was America's musical golden boy. But here's the uncomfortable truth. A golden boy is often expected to stay golden, always smiling, always humble, always safe. But the problem with perfection is that it leaves no room for being human. And John Denver was very human. He had strong opinions, deep emotions, and a restless spirit that didn't always fit into the polished mold the public wanted him to stay in. As his fame climbed, so did the pressure to maintain an image that wasn't fully him. The mountain man image, simple, kind, joyful, was real, yes, but it wasn't the whole truth. Behind every ovation was a man trying to reconcile who he was with what the world needed him to be. And as we'll see, sometimes that inner conflict doesn't stay hidden forever. The activist they didn't see coming. John Denver didn't just sing about the earth, he made it his mission to protect it. While most artists stayed comfortably within the lines of entertainment, John stepped out, stood up, and spoke loudly. By the 1980s, he had transformed into one of the most recognizable voices in environmental activism, long before green became trendy and sustainability was a marketable buzzword. He wasn't content with writing love letters to the mountains in his songs. He wanted to make sure those mountains remained standing. He founded the WinStar Foundation, dedicated to environmental education and sustainable living. He spoke passionately about deforestation, pollution, overconsumption. These weren't fashionable topics at the time, but that didn't stop him. And then there was Congress. John Denver stood before the U.S. Senate to testify against the Parents Music Resource Center's push to censor music. Alongside artists like Frank Zappa and Dee Snider, John's calm, eloquent defense of artistic freedom was unexpected, but powerful. Who would have guessed the guy who wrote Sunshine on My Shoulders would go to battle over First Amendment rights? He also supported NASA and dreamed of becoming the first civilian musician in space. He trained with them. He passed the tests. He was ready. But when it came time to choose, NASA picked someone else. Still, his passion for space exploration never dimmed. But all this advocacy came at a price. The industry that had once loved his soft voice and clean image began to retreat. He was no longer just the gentle folk singer. He was now political, unpredictable, and, worse, principled. And in show business, principles can be dangerous. Because when an artist stops just singing and starts speaking, the room gets quieter, and not always in a good way. Rocky Mountain roots and recognition. John Denver wasn't just inspired by Colorado, he embodied it. The rugged peaks, the stillness of alpine mornings, the feeling of being small beneath an endless sky, all of it lived in his voice. His home in Aspen wasn't just a retreat from the spotlight. It was a return to something pure, a sanctuary where he could shed the expectations of celebrity and just be. In 1974, Colorado recognized what many already knew, naming him the state's official poet laureate. It was more than a title. It was a symbol. Denver didn't just sing about Colorado, he gave it a soul. His song Rocky Mountain High was so deeply woven into the fabric of the state that, in 2007, it became one of Colorado's official state songs. A decade earlier, West Virginia had embraced country roads in the same way. His music didn't just reflect these places, it defined them. That kind of cultural impact is rare, almost mythic. But here's the part most people didn't see. While his songs were rooted in the earth, John himself was beginning to feel untethered. Fame had given him recognition, awards, and a place in music history. But it had also started pulling him away from the very things he sang about. The stillness he craved in the mountains was harder to find when tour dates, interviews, and obligations kept him on the move. The peace he longed for became fleeting, and perhaps most painful of all. The growing distance wasn't just between him and the public. It was creeping into his personal life, too. From friends, from family, from himself. It's a strange paradox. The man who wrote some of the most grounding songs of the 20th century was slowly losing his own sense of grounding. Love, fatherhood, and the fracture beneath. In 1967, John Denver married Annie Martell, a quiet, grounded woman from Minnesota who didn't care much for the spotlight. For a man who'd spent most of his life searching for belonging, Annie offered something he'd never had before: stability. She was his anchor in a world that was moving faster than he could sometimes handle. And when he wrote Annie's song, it wasn't just a love song, it was a thank you. A recognition of the peace she brought him in a life otherwise filled with movement, noise, and pressure. Together, they adopted 2 children, Zachary and Anna Kate. For a time, John seemed to have it all: music, a family, a beautiful home in Aspen. It was the image of a man who had finally found his version of home. But images can be deceiving. Behind the scenes, the cracks were forming. Fame has a strange gravity. It doesn't just lift you, it pulls at everything around you. The demands of John's career meant long tours, constant attention, and a version of life that wasn't always built for intimacy. The distance between him and Annie grew, not just physically, but emotionally. Small misunderstandings became patterns. Resentment crept in like cold through the windows of their once warm home. By the early 1980s, their marriage had collapsed under the weight of it all. The infamous story about John sawing their bed in half with a chainsaw after a particularly bitter argument, it wasn't a tabloid exaggeration. It was a moment of raw emotional expression from a man who often sang about love, but, in that moment, felt completely severed from it. His second marriage, to Australian actress Cassandra Delaney, offered a fresh start. They had a daughter, Jessie Bell, and for a while there was hope again. But the same pattern emerged: distance, disconnect, and the slow erosion of what looked beautiful from the outside. By 1993, John was once again alone. Older, wiser, and undeniably more weathered. Not bitter, necessarily, but bruised by the emotional costs of a life lived so publicly. He had sung about love his entire career, had tried to build it, hold it, save it. But the truth is, sometimes love isn't enough to hold back the storms within. Behind the scenes of the smile, John Denver's public image was almost impossibly wholesome. Smiling eyes, soft voice, guitar in hand, singing about sunshine, country roads, and the beauty of the natural world. But beneath that iconic smile was a man wrestling with shadows few ever saw. Denver never tried to hide the fact that he struggled with depression. In fact, he often spoke with surprising honesty about the emotional weight he carried. Especially as fame began to feel more like a burden than a blessing, he also battled alcohol dependency, a coping mechanism that spiraled into arrests and public embarrassment. In 1993 and again in 1994, he was arrested for driving under the influence. For fans who saw him as a symbol of purity and light, it was jarring. But John never pretended to be perfect. He wasn't interested in pretending. What he wanted, desperately, was peace. That's perhaps what made his music so powerful. It wasn't written from a place of constant joy, but from the longing for it. His songs weren't the reflections of a man who had found all the answers. They were written by someone still searching. Still, he kept going. He wrote. He sang. He gave concerts that filled theaters with warmth, even when he himself felt cold inside. Music was his therapy, his shield, and sometimes his only safe space. But pain has a way of catching up to even the most resilient souls. And by the mid-1990s, the cracks were widening. John was facing aging, loss, fading celebrity, and inner questions that fame could never answer. He wasn't just a beloved musician anymore. He was a man quietly unraveling beneath a legacy too heavy to carry alone. Until that one day in 1997, when everything changed, and the silence that followed asked more questions than any song could answer. The crash that shouldn't have happened. October 12, 1997. It was a clear day in Monterey Bay, California. John Denver, 53 years old, walked toward the sleek, lightweight Rutan Long EZ experimental aircraft, his latest flying obsession. To outsiders, it was just another casual flight. But in hindsight, it was anything but. John loved flying. It wasn't a hobby. It was a passion in the sky. He felt something he rarely did on the ground. Control, clarity, escape. The freedom he sang about in leaving on a jet plane and Eagle and the Hawk wasn't metaphorical, it was aviation. But the Long EZ wasn't just another airplane. It had a unique fuel system that was already a topic of concern among experienced pilots. The fuel selector valve, inexplicably, was located behind the pilot's left shoulder, making it nearly impossible to reach without twisting dangerously mid-flight. The FAA had flagged it. Other pilots had warned about it. And John, he knew the design flaw. Shortly after takeoff, the engine sputtered. Then silence witnesses reported seeing the aircraft descend rapidly, veering left and plunging into the bay. The investigation confirmed it. Denver had likely run out of fuel in the selected tank and was trying to switch to the backup mid-air, but the location of the valve meant that maneuvering his body compromised the plane's stability. He lost control. Here's the haunting part. John had just purchased the aircraft and had very limited time flying it. He wasn't legally permitted to fly at the time because of previous DUI convictions, and this particular plane wasn't even properly registered in his name. There was no flight plan filed, no radio communication, no margin for error. So, why did he fly? Some close friends suggested he was emotionally worn down, financial pressures, personal loneliness, ongoing frustration with the media. Perhaps flying was the last place he still felt truly himself. Or perhaps, just perhaps, he didn't care about the risk. Was it a tragic accident caused by poor engineering and bad luck? Or was it the final act of a man quietly collapsing under the weight of everything he once carried so beautifully? The legacy he left behind. The mystery of John Denver's death may never be solved in black and white. The cause? Maybe mechanical, maybe emotional, maybe both. But while that moment in the sky ended his life, it didn't define it. What truly endures is everything he gave the world before that final flight. He left behind songs that still soothe. Take Me Home. Country Roads isn't just a melody, it's a map to something we all crave. Belonging, Annie's song, isn't just a love ballad, it's an open-hearted surrender. Rocky Mountain High doesn't just celebrate nature, it's a spiritual anthem for anyone who's ever found peace under a mountain sky. But his legacy isn't just musical, it's emotional, philosophical, real. He showed us that you can be gentle and still be strong, that you can speak softly and still move millions, that you can struggle and still choose beauty. His activism taught us that art doesn't have to be separate from responsibility, that you can love the earth and fight for it, that you can stand for something even if it costs you everything. John Denver was not a man made for perfection. He was made for truth. And that truth wasn't always pretty. It was raw, flawed, and achingly sincere. Maybe that's why his music still feels so personal. Because he didn't just sing to us, he sang with us. He put melody to emotions we didn't know how to name. And in doing so, he gave millions of people something they didn't even realize they needed.